is jackal language like? Jackal language, as I mentioned, is a language with moralistic judgment. Think in terms of who's right, who's wrong, who's good.
Welcome back to part 2 of Nonviolent Communication, the Trivium, Natural Law, and the Human Potential Movement. Now that we have described some of the principles of NVC, let's compare it with true philosophy. The intent of NVC is to create connection and conversation by having useful beliefs, the NVC tenets, and sadly this requires turning off discernment, which is more than a red flag. Contrarily, the intent of philosophy is to arrive at objective truth and morality in any given situation, which requires understanding first principles. NVC should obviously not be a worldview or a philosophy, as its fundamental assumptions are false. Therefore, it should be dispensed with entirely, as once the value is adequately reframed, it no longer resembles NVC. Yet some may argue that NVC is not a worldview and does not have worldview tenets. But in order for NVC to be used, the tenets must be believed to be true. When you research, you will find that there are core assumptions always mentioned, as they are necessary to use NVC. Like structuralism, postmodernism, and NLP, the goal of NVC is to work on the structure of language instead of the consciousness behind it. The structure is then not a metaphysical one, but a relativistic one, based on the fluctuating needs at any given time. How we communicate, how we act, is not the subject of philosophy, because these things are based in context, and every context is as unique as every moment. Gender expression is in constant flux, with the law of rhythm and the law of vibration. For example, in terms of doing the great work, sometimes it is good to be aggressive in communication with the sacred masculine, and sometimes it is good to be gentle with the sacred feminine. The hard and soft styles of communication both serve a purpose if done in the right context, with the right intent, and with understanding. Sometimes a person needs to be shaken from their delusions, as when one is trying to save one from a dangerous colt, in other times gently coached to understand a simple distinction. The territory always changes, and our responses have to be tailored to specific events, conditions, people, and people's psychology. On the other hand, natural law philosophy regards the absolute, immutable principles of creation, not a relative description of how individuals should behave with other people, since the manifestation of absolute principles is different in every situation. Attempting to create a system of how these qualities should manifest can only be relativistic and very imbalanced, especially when it does not include the masculine of critical thinking and logic. While we cannot hold on to an ideology to facilitate social interaction, we can gather truth of any situation when grounded in objective truth itself, natural law. Without understanding natural law, we cannot consistently determine the multitude of truths in reality, as we have no absolute ground. Thus, we will be easily swayed by the whims of culture, ego, and self-interest, as the pragmatist. Simply, the manifestation of morality in communication, the relative dimension, cannot be turned into an absolute philosophy. It is rather the application of philosophy. This is why NVC and philosophy are incompatible. Now, those in the Trivium camp who advocate NVC are certainly not suggesting to use it as an ideology, but as a tool, and this may be possible in an extremely narrow context. And, to repeat from earlier, to reframe NVC so drastically requires that it be called something else. If one desires to connect with someone, there are many ways to do that, and coming from the heart with greater empathy and compassion has its own authentic language and expression that cannot be linguistically constructed. NVC cannot be a tool or methodology for identifying and communicating feelings and needs, as that is the work of self-awareness. While methodologies are good in the linear progression of thought, in terms of awareness, they actually filter perception when you want to be able to perceive everything. This was a point made by Jiddu Krishnamurti and also Roy Masters, who considered formless meditation to be an effective tool for self-awareness, as the absence of methodology or dogma. Simply, there is no formula for self-awareness.
When you understand or investigate into yourself what you are, that is self-awareness, to know what you are, not according to psychologists, not according to some philosophers, not according to the speaker, but to know, to be aware of your own nature, of your own structure, of your own thinking, feeling. Find out the whole structure of it. Therefore, self-knowing becomes extraordinarily important. Not the description given by another, but the actually what is, what you are. Not what you think you are, or what you think you should be, but what actually is going on. You know how difficult that is? Have you ever tried it? To be aware actually what is taking place inside the skin, as it were. Because we observe through the knowledge of the past, right? Through what you have acquired as an experience or what you have gathered from another. With that knowledge, you examine. Therefore, you are examining yourself from the background of the past. Therefore, you are not actually observing what is. So there must be freedom to observe. And then, in that observation, the whole structure and the nature of oneself begins to unroll. You're following all this? Please give, for this morning at least, an hour's attention. Because very few people will tell you all this. Because they have self-interest, they want to form organizations, groups, you follow the whole structure of that business. So please, if you don't mind, give your complete attention to what is being said. So to understand oneself, there must be observation. And that observation can only take place now. And the now is not the movement of the past which observes the now.
Unfortunately, Krishnamurti could not articulate natural law as he didn't quite go all the way. Yet, in some sense, you could consider that he understands it in a feminine way, intuitively. He is often taken out of context, like Rosenberg does here.
In fact, the philosopher Krishnamurti says that to observe without evaluating is the highest form of human intelligence.
Krishnamurti was not about rejecting evaluation and discernment, but about rejecting the bias and prejudice that evaluation and discernment can foster when it becomes part of an inaccurate worldview. I talk about this in my Love and Philosophy videos if you want to hear more. When not used as a tool for self-awareness, but as a tool in expression, like communication and rhetoric, methodologies definitely have their place, and obviously with developing the mind like the Trivium. But we should never be stuck to one methodology, as we learn to integrate many skills as context changes moment to moment. Getting stuck to an ideology, methodology, or tool causes one to see the world as mechanical and static, rather than organic and dynamic. NVC shouldn't be the method of communication, as there should be various methods and styles of communication. A different tool is used in a different context, as dogmatic thinking occurs when we prescribe one methodology to all contexts. Dogma is against philosophy, as philosophy regards what can be applied to all contexts, the universals themselves. When it comes to becoming a more compassionate and caring person, this cannot be generated by learning skills and techniques, but by working on consciousness, as they are the qualities of consciousness. Skills and techniques are still useful, but only when used by consciousness that has developed virtuous qualities. Compassion cannot be engineered with language, but cultivated with development. As Plato and Aristotle understood, one should never make a human system from virtues and characteristics, as this is not the realm of strict logic. Once we think that a tool or methodology can create a quality, then it is artificially created, and this is usually done with a social agenda, to get what we want in a social context. In exploring the roots of NVC, we have to examine a network of ideas. While some have examined the connections of people between nefarious ideologies and associations to the socialist globalist think tanks to reveal conspiracy, it is more likely that many of the proponents of false ideologies are not conscious of what they are part of and believe that they are doing good. Rather than dissect who's part of the conspiracy, it is much more wise to deconstruct the ideologies that support the conspiracy and the control system with reason alone. At the end of the 19th century was Friedrich Nietzsche and existentialism. God is dead, or more accurately, metaphysics is dead, would be the post-Enlightenment anthem, in which philosophy descended into solipsism, ultra-subjectivity, and moral relativism. But in truth, metaphysics can never be dead. It is what is, regardless of human perception. Nietzsche's perspectivism would become the basis for postmodernism, and in his book Beyond Good and Evil, he would say that the world is not made of facts, but interpretations. Every perspective would be seen as equally true. Later, Martin Heidegger's existentialism turned metaphysics upside down as well, so that philosophy was no longer the search for objective truth and knowledge of being, as in the days of antiquity, but creating the meaning of being through creative exploration and arbitration. Philosophy became poetry. While we should not seek to oppose philosophy with creativity, existentialism conflated the two, giving the dangerous impression that truth is created. After the existential crisis over the death of philosophy, in which philosophers gave up on metaphysics, came pragmatism, as now philosophy was narrowed to the practicality of ideas. Truth became whatever works for me, and whatever contained the most cash value, referencing William James, and this would become the basis for the New Age in self-help businesses.
You open it, they come, and they tear you apart.
Even if we don't say it out loud, even if we think it, if we are even thinking that what somebody else does is wrong, it decreases the likelihood that we will get what we want.
Rosenberg is definitely getting what he wants: status, money, career, fame. Another postmodern ideological predecessor was structuralism, which would act as a metaphysical proxy, since man's search for the structure of reality cannot be eradicated, only corrupted. Rather than seeing origin, nature, and objective reality as the structure of reality, culture would become the structure and its cultural narratives. Structuralism has been summarized as, quote, the belief that phenomena of human life is not intelligible except through their interrelations. These relations constitute a structure, and behind local variations in the surface phenomenon, there are constant laws of abstract culture, end quote. In the early to mid-19th century, modern linguistics sought to overthrow our classical understanding of language with the trivium subjects, logic, grammar, and rhetoric, for overly abstract theories that challenged metaphysical realism and that language could actually correspond to reality. Structuralist Ferdinand de Saussure would see that meaning only exists in the relationship and differences between words to other words. This would corrupt the Aristotelian categories of substance and attribute in general grammar, in the absolute and natural law. Postmodern linguistics contradicts the fact that substances exist and have essences not only independent of their attributes, like Kant's transcendental self, but independent of their connection to other things. Modern linguistics would directly attack the existence of self as an immutable substance, which carries an obvious socialist collectivist agenda, as we shall see, and destroys the basis for true spirituality. Later, the post-structuralists, the French postmodernists, would even suggest the dangerous idea that self is a creation or byproduct of the network of ideas. This is a rehashing of David Hume's empiricism, who saw self as a byproduct of the bundle of sensations. Hume also tried to destroy metaphysics, reducing all things to relations. Without metaphysics, language becomes the collective products of social interaction, rather than reflecting any independently existing reality. Ludwig Wittgenstein studied the philosophy of language, and while he began with the task of creating a mathematical formula for language, with the logical positivists, he ultimately gave up on logic and became a pragmatist, saying that, quote, most of the time the meaning of a word is its use, end quote. He also brought forth the concept of language games, which maintain that language does not correspond to reality and that concepts do not need clarity for meaning, as all meaning is context dependent. I just want to make the point that I'm not saying that some truths are not context dependent, because they are, but that even so they have a correspondence with the absolute, which is not context dependent, in order to be truth at all, and this is the two-truth doctrine of the absolute and relative. Essentially, this will lead to the idea that language creates reality, and we must analyze this carefully as it is a dangerous half-truth. Here, Jocelyn discusses the problem.
There is an idea floating around in academia that linguistics is primary to consciousness. We're not able to have more elaborate thinking unless we're able to speak. And at some level, that's true. We can communicate to a certain level, and our thinking will only go so long until we can start communicating with each other. When we can externalize our ideas through thoughts, that allows us to start moving into more and more abstractions. But to take the idea that reality begins with linguistics, which then dictates the structure of society, which then affects the consciousness of the individual, which then creates an individual's reality, is this idea of a stolen concept again.
So
I've heard other people say that, for instance, unless you have a word for something, it doesn't exist for you. And I say that's not true. Like if there's a tree out there, you might not be able to articulate that, you might not have any language, but you're not going to run into it. This is something that's prevalent around the basis behind, say, social constructivism, that we are really the result of our interactions in society. And this has its foundation in linguistics, in cybernetics back in the 60s, and actually cybernetics and a lot of NLP was actually drawn off Chomsky's work with linguistics. But it's this idea, again, of taking a higher order concept, linguistics, placing it as an axiom, and then rebuilding your concepts that way. It's a misintegration of information again.
Jocelyn suspects and intuits that the premise language creates reality is false, which he can only deconstruct by saying that this ideology claims that there are no first principles when that language creates reality is a first principle, thus a stolen concept. But as we saw earlier, because he fails to understand the law of mind, he still believes that language constructs higher order concepts, which even though built on the lower language closer to objective reality, reflects no objective reality in and of itself. This is still modern linguistics.
Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that linguistics isn't a foundation for higher order concepts. That is the case, and it doesn't mean that we're not effective.
To see how modern linguistics is still going strong, here is a 2017 clip of a woman who insinuates that language creates reality due to the differences in different languages. And here we make the point that the Trivium is about general grammar, not about specific grammar, as the same objective reality exists no matter your language.
Some languages have different sounds, they have different vocabularies, and they also have different structures, very importantly, different structures.
I just want to interject right here that this woman is confusing two questions, as you will see. One is whether language shapes the way that we think, and the other is whether language creates reality. Now, obviously, language shapes the way we think, which is why we want to study language, so that our thoughts can be more in conformity with reality. But the answer to the second question is no. Language does not create reality, except that our thoughts influence our actions, which then create things in objective reality.
That begs the question, does the language we speak shape the way we think? Now, this is an ancient question. People have been speculating about this question for forever. Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor, said, to have a second language is to have a second soul. Strong statement that language crafts reality. But on the other hand, Shakespeare has Juliet say, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Well, that suggests that maybe language doesn't craft reality. These arguments have gone back and forth for thousands of years. But until recently, there hasn't been any data to help us decide either way. Recently, in my lab and other labs around the world, we've started doing research, and now we have actual scientific data to weigh in on this question. So,
just because different languages express things differently doesn't mean that they create different realities. Objective reality remains the same for everyone.
Now, the beauty of linguistic diversity is that it reveals to us just how ingenious and how flexible the human mind is. Human minds have invented not one cognitive universe, but 7,000 languages spoken around the world.
And we can create many more. Languages, of course, are living things that we can hone and change to suit our needs.
We're in a need consciousness. We're in a need consciousness.
Let's just ban the word bossy. Let's ban bossy. Ban bossy.
Seriously, by 4:30 this afternoon, you will never hear another insult. It won't exist. Insults will not exist.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. You won't have seen the dictionary, 10th edition yet, Smith? It's that thick. The 11th edition will be that thick.
Well, the revolution will be complete when the language is perfect.
secrets.
Appalling act must, can, and will be terminated. The forces of darkness and the treasonable maggots who collaborate with them must, can, and will be wiped.
Interestingly, tragedy and hope makes this modern linguistics err, as there is a differentiation between words and the things they refer to. What people are getting confused with here, and this applies to general semantics as well, is that the nature of language, which is to express reality, thoughts, feelings, and actions, has both matter and form, two components. Matter is the system of symbols created by convention, which is why different languages have different words for the same things. And form is the meaning, which deals with metaphysics as absolutes, substances not created by culture. Once we think that words are the building blocks for reality, then we are lost in relativism, as words can be created and destroyed. But in actuality, the things that the words refer to cannot be created nor destroyed with thought or communication itself. The reason why language can correspond to reality is because reality is even more multidimensional than the dimensions that language can describe. Therefore, higher order concepts can reflect the mental aspect of the cosmos. Okay, here is objective reality and the language which describes reality, as it is a main use of language to describe actual things, whether concrete or abstract. If done accurately, then there is correspondence between language and reality. What contributes to no accuracy is not understanding language logic and metaphysics in which they rest in. Also, corrupting language with these ideological institutions we've been speaking of does also corrupt our understanding of reality. This can take the form of not knowing definitions, etymology, or the meaning behind words and their logical relationships. Because actions are driven by the mind, then with corrupted language which presents corrupted worldviews, our actions will not be in alignment with objective reality. Thus, we will create false realities through our actions. This is how language creates reality in a sense, but it does not create objective reality. And our misalignment with objective reality creates negative consequences due to moral causality. Moral causality is a principle of objective reality. The general semantics of Alfred Korzybski attempted to be a science of changing communication systems, delineating principles of tracking a constantly changing territory. He took a non-Aristotelian stance on systems, challenging the basic notion that a thing is what it is, the law of identity, the law of contradiction, challenging the law of the excluded middle, and also the law of polarity, saying that change is the only constant. He was not holistic and could not see that static identities and essences exist in the midst of change, like the self, the one immutable constant. L. Ron Hubbard, who created Scientology, used general semantics in his book Dianetics. It should be no surprise that the Institute of General Semantics has its ties with the United Nations.
Languages are living things that we can change to suit our needs.
Here is the New York Center for NVC. To have 27,000 registered members and an active participating population of over 5,000 in 100 countries definitely requires political funding. Tom Bond, the founder, was a disciple of Rosenberg for 15 years, and here it states that this group, the NYNVC, is a United Nations civil society organization.
Globalists often cloak their ultimate goal behind less threatening labels, terms as world order, collective security, interdependence, global community, economic integration, or convergence. However, all point down the same road. Yet candid admissions do occur. Occasionally, they even expose official policy. One of the most blatant is recorded in a confidential 1961 study. Commissioned by the U.S. State Department, a world effectively controlled by the United Nations directly states the key point.
It is world government we are discussing here, inescapable.
The author, MIT professor Lincoln P. Bloomfield, also explains that the UN would have to have an unchallengeable monopoly on military power.
A world effectively controlled by the United Nations is one in which world government would come about through the establishment of supranational institutions characterized by mandatory universal membership. National disarmament is a condition for effective UN control.
The Bloomfield study is grounded in official American policy. That policy is stated openly in Freedom from War, the United States program for general and complete disarmament in a peaceful world. It was presented to the UN General Assembly by President Kennedy. The document calls for the transfer of national armaments to UN control in 3 stages. Stage 2 proposes that
the UN Peace Force shall be established and progressively strengthened.
at the dawn of the 21st century, programs to complete this stage are firmly established and well underway. The Freedom from War blueprint concludes with Stage 3,
where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN Peace Force.
This policy has guided every administration since. Even so-called conservative Republican administrations have been committed to building this new world order.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A new world order. A new world order.
Gregory Bateson was also into general semantics, which became systems theory and cybernetics, as we will get to.
And this ties right back, again, to Bateson with cybernetics. Okay, this idea.
And let me just add that we've exposed recently, and Joe Atwell has uncovered that Gregory Bateson was a key figure in the creation and founding of the CIA, and he was brought in by General Wild Bill Donovan to present the reason as to why the OSS should be converted into the CIA and kept post-war.
He's also the one that started the conferences on mind with Newman.
And he was also at all of the Macy Foundation conferences, or many of them, which were related to MKUltra, and many of the conferences there were Control of the Mind was the title.
Okay, that's it. And also Esalen. He was all over Esalen
right,
as well.
he was absolutely one of the key people at Esalen, and he's also the one that we've exposed that came up with the double bind that...
I wanted to see a recent event on the topic of general semantics and found this from the New York Society for General Semantics. Nora Bateson, Gregory Bateson's daughter, reveals the dangerous implications of this ideology and its attack on the self. We can see how these ideas have led to postmodernism.
So this book, first of all, is a combination of all sorts of pieces. There's poetry, there's essays, there's short stories, there's just tiny little reflections, and you can pick it up and start anywhere and just read as much as you want, and there's different ideas and different approaches all the way through it. The concept was sort of along the lines of, there's this big body of theory that is inside my family and my work. And the question is, how do you live into that? What does it look like in your daily life? What does it mean to have all that theory, not only as an intellectual pursuit, but as a way of living, as a way of being a partner or a mother or a professional or a friend, or how does it live into my world? So I thought I would share that through these essays. This one's called Identity with an I. Who am I? Grammar incorrectly suggests that I am singular. A verb conjugation for plural first person is missing, not for we, but for I. That singularity is a semantic, ideological, epistemological, cultural, biological, ecological, evolutionary, epigenetic, gender-specific, nationalistic error. That singularity is a great violence and a silence to all that I am in plurals. The pronouns are misleading. I carries the suggestion that I am somehow individual, independent, when interdependence is the law. We seems to be more inclusive choice, but it erases the multiplicity of perspectives. Which we? We, as in Western civilization, whatever that is, or humanity, or the entirety of life, what does we mean? And as a white girl, I better be damn careful with we, assuming the right to speak to experiences I do not, cannot know. We is less independent, but somehow not conducive to multiple mutual learning. You separates us, points a finger, sets us up for confusion. They is an illusion. Us is somehow not them. When I lived in Thailand, I learned to use pronouns to reveal relationship. But it was so complicated that I finally just began to use my name. Nora is hungry. Nora is your friend. Third person, first person, second person, all at once. Perhaps using all the pronouns will generate a healthy confusion. I am, we are, you are, they includes, etc. My childhood English teachers are rolling their eyes. Let them. The world is burning. We're not seeing the integrity of life. Grammar needs to evolve.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words.
When it comes down to it, general semantics is a postmodern subjectivized, intellectualized proxy of the subject of general grammar in the Trivium. Here it is stated that Nora Bateson has a whole research team consisting of 100 groups around the world to answer the question, how can we create a context in which to study contexts? Cosmos magazine is connected to the United Nations. The answer, of course, is metaphysics, which is not created. Once you create a system, you're creating slavery, as it is out of alignment with truth. General semantics will become the basis for later complexity chaos theory and systems theory, the idea of prioritizing interactions of things over individual substances. The pioneer of systems theory is Erwin Laszlo, president of the Club of Budapest, member of the Club of Rome, advisor to UNESCO, a United Nations organization. These organizations that Laszlo is part of desire to create a single global interconnected technocracy over man, and therefore systems theory is the academic presentation of systems engineering, which also relates to social engineering and organizational psychology, which overlays the political agenda for control. This is about controlling the dynamics of interaction by focusing on the structure of interaction. We can consider education, government, and the media to be systems of control. Related is cybernetics, which is described in this article as the study of feedback and derived concepts such as communication and control in living organisms, machines, and organizations. Its focus is how anything, digital, mechanical, or biological, processes information, reacts to information, and changes or can be changed to better accomplish these first two tasks." End quote. Systems theory tends to see that individual behavior is the result of its interdependency with outside systems, concerned with the external dynamics of evolution rather than the inward dynamics of the individual. This in turn promotes codependency between man and the authoritative institutions that enslave him.
When interdependence is the law.
The truth is that each individual and his own change is not context dependent, as each man has the ability to rise above culture and social conditioning, which postmodernism will tell you is not possible. The goal of man is to become independent, autonomous, and sovereign, not to merge with the cage of a social system. The system sciences obfuscate self-knowledge to give the social sphere dominance, when the individual is merely a part in the system of manipulation. We see this with the New Age Gaia and web of life beliefs, and with evolutionary theory and its concept of interdependent emergence. While it is a spiritual truth that everything is interconnected, we must see how the dark side uses this truth for their own ends. Now, this actually relates to the progressive education by John Dewey, in which children were seen as products of the environment, so the focus was placed on the environment rather than teaching the individual important abstract concepts like language and arithmetic. Yet, learning the Trivium is incredibly important in order to structure our minds properly. Because children are not taught the Trivium in school, they do not learn how to speak in conformity with their thoughts or think in conformity with reality, only to regurgitate the dictates of social authority and conform to their environment by reflecting its values. The ideological basis for learning theory was constructivism, in which its first principle is, there is no knowledge independent of the meaning attributed to experience, constructed by the learner or community of learners. End quote. We can see how this relates to structuralism. Now, those in the Trivium group have discussed the dark use of the Trivium. which can be seen in modern education, as the process of indoctrination is an evil agenda to disrupt the information man has available to him, as well as disrupt how he processes information by teaching him what to think and not how to think. This is why man becomes prey to belief systems, as government itself is a belief system. Man with no knowledge and no logic is controlled man, and the chaotic output of his behavior due to the inner disorder brings upon the natural consequence of external proxy order in the form of government. Real order comes from within the individual, but systems theory has turned everything inside out so that the center of man becomes a single global authority.
When interdependence is the law.
In psychology, constructivism was also promoted by Jean Piaget, in which he expresses the anti-metaphysical statement, quote, "There exists no structure without construction," end quote. This ignores that humans can actually receive information and knowledge about themselves in the environment that is not constructive but reflective. While there is much that humans construct due to human creativity, humans should not be constructing facts. Also in psychology, psychiatrist Milton Erickson used language to create hypnosis, called the indirect technique, which is the use of vagueness, ambiguity, and confusion in conversation to create suggestibility, receptivity, and a mild trance. We can clearly see how Milton's vague language has become the style of postmodern rhetoric, which keeps college students in a trance-like hypnosis, in which they can never make direct meaning out of anything. This would become part of NLP. Ultimately, the purpose of education is to confuse, not to educate. The field of psychology is directly tied with the US government and the CIA in terms of psychological warfare, which was established by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in Great Britain, which unified with America. Governments wanted to know how to create behaviors in people through the mind, to have power over them and make them better slaves. This is how they maintain the power differential.
Shall I tell you why we brought you here? To cure you, to make you sane.
Understanding people's psychology is knowing how to control and manipulate them, and the government has a big stake in controlling the mass mind of the population. MKUltra Dr. Ewan Cameron, who has served the OSS, formerly the CIA, performed mind control experiments under the field of psychiatry. He was the director for the Canadian Psychiatric Association and American Psychiatric Association, as well as the president of the World Psychiatric Association. He is but one out of many. Cameron's experiments had damaged people so badly that the Canadian government gave former patients monetary compensation. In this article, a man is upset that he did not receive the compensation for having 10 electroshock treatments short of the guideline. Yet he underwent weeks of drug-induced sleep with 20 electroshock treatments. Psychiatrist Brock Chisholm, president of the World Health Organization, in 1957 said that the reinterpretation and eventual eradication of the concept of right and wrong are the belated objectives of nearly all psychotherapy. This is a complete reversal of meaning, as most of our mental health issues are actually based in moral relativism. We will soon see how humanistic psychology of Carl Rogers would be exactly what Chisholm desired. In 1966, Rosenberg was awarded diplomat status in clinical psychology from the American Board of Examiners in Professional Psychology. This board comes from the American Psychological Association, founded in 1892 under President G. Stanley Hall, who was a eugenicist and social Darwinist. Other members include William James, John Dewey, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Edward Thorndike. Marshall says that we should never reward people with our language, but here he is being awarded from an elite institution, a trained dog of the dark occultists. Here is an article about the American Psychological Association working with the Department of Defense during the Bush administration on what they call interrogation techniques, which is really just instructions of how to torture people, at Guantanamo Bay. The prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay were there for being terrorists without going through the courts in a trial, as terrorists, under Bush's definition, includes anarchists and anyone against the violence of the state.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Philadelphia burned fiercely for 19 hours yet never collapsed. How could the South Tower at the World Trade Center fall after burning less than 1 hour? How could the North Tower fall after burning only for 2? How could the jet fuel have caused the collapse when the Federal Emergency Management and other government agencies have stated that most of the jet fuel was gone in the initial fireball? Moreover, how could the fires have caused the collapse at all, since recent fire tests by Cardington found that a steel building survived fires and experiments with extreme temperatures beyond the range possible with jet fuel?
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
In psychology, we have humanistic psychology of Carl Rogers, who was Rosenberg's mentor and a pioneer of the human potential movement. Rogers claimed that experience was the highest authority, another relativistic belief. He came up with client-centered therapy, much different than psychoanalysis, under the belief that the client knows best, and the client should therefore direct the entire therapeutic process, as the therapist would merely listen and offer empathy and positive reinforcement. The focus is creating an environment of validation, and later this would become part of the extreme social validation given in New Age cults. Thus, humanistic psychology in many ways combined the New Age and business with psychology, a direct assault to true psychology. In the humanistic context, as humanism places man at the center of all things, psychology became about getting your ego stroked and pursuing narcissistic fulfillment and success rather than actually resolving psychological issues. Ignore the negative. This makes a profitable business model.
My dad makes harsh judgments and insulting remarks.
Oh my God, you've killed my poor jackal. He could have handled the harsh, that was one judgment, but insulting, harsh and insulting, those are two judgments.
Actually, he does use insulting words.
No, there is no such thing. After today, in fact, seriously, by 4:30 this afternoon, you will never hear another insult. It won't exist. Insults will not exist. I'm going to show you to use some technology today that takes insults and criticism out of the waves, airwaves. So that no matter what your father says, you can never hear another harsh statement or another insult, because we're going to show you today how to use this technology.
Emotional mind control comes in a couple of forms. Well, if this is unpleasant, the New Age variant is this right here. If it's unpleasant, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to see it, and I certainly won't want to tell others about it. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil.
Therapy became nothing more than getting paid to be someone's best friend, and most agreeable friend at that.
Anytime I've seen somebody as a proponent of NVC, it's always come down to that. It has had nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with communicating better. It has to do with getting people to agree with you.
Client-centered therapy would fuel the culture of narcissism, with the following tenets that would become part of the New Age. Number 1, no one can know anything more than anyone else. No, there are degrees of knowledge in consciousness. Number 2, only a person can know themselves, and that no one can know another person. Not true. Another person can know what is going on with another person by observing their behaviors through the course of time. If that person has more self-knowledge than the other person, he can understand that person more than that person can understand himself. When we go to a psychologist, it should be because we are seeking to understand our psychology, in which the psychologist understands more. Number 3, no one is ever wrong, all experience is truth. This is moral relativism.
The first thing I'll suggest is you can't teach anybody anything.
That's right.
And to have that as an objective is itself to create problems. So let's change the objective. Let's never try to teach anybody anything or to change anybody.
This is a full attack to the subject of knowledge. People are no longer seeking self-knowledge or truth, but hearing what they want to hear. Psychologists and psychiatrists would effectively feed into people's delusions, as this feeds into the delusion of the control system. The real role of psychologists should be to give insight to the clients that the client cannot see himself, pointing out blind spots, shadow, contradiction, wrong behaviors, false beliefs, as the true method of self-development is apophysis. A psychologist should have more self-knowledge than the client. Client-centered therapy sought to eradicate the hierarchical relationship between client and psychiatrist, like the postmodernists who desired to eradicate the hierarchical relationship between opposites, seeing the statement that rationality is better than irrationality as oppressive. And this resonates with the feminist doctrine. Ryan Eisler, systems theorist and Club of Rome member, saw that culture infected man with the power dynamic of the masculine against the feminine, oppressor against oppressive. She introduced the term domination culture to describe a system of top-down ranking, ultimately backed by fear and violence, of man over man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, and man over nature. We can see how this directly influenced NVC. Her observations are only partially correct, as this tends to place blame on the pathological masculine, when the pathological feminine is just as responsible. If women didn't support their sons, husbands, and brothers going to war, then they wouldn't. There would be no wars if there were no order followers, and those people who submit to false authority with cowardice. To negate the principle of self-defense of the sacred masculine is just as bad as violence, as it encourages violence to oneself. Imagine if every Jew in Nazi Germany owned firearms, so that when the government came to take them away, they wouldn't be able to do so without a fight. What if the Jews knew that they had the right to defend themselves against the evil of government? The key word here is knew. What if they knew? Knowledge. Knowledge is required. The idea that culture victimizes man, the tenet of NVC, is a half-truth, as man victimizes himself by not gaining the knowledge of objective morality and the knowledge to defend himself. While we recognize the importance of criticizing top-down authority of the control system, it is only effective when there is bottom-up ignorance. When people conform because they lack knowledge that all authority is an illusion, and that might makes right should never be our moral imperative. Eisler didn't criticize the order following of the military, as it is the military that performs the actions given from the top down. Feminism would lead to creating a victim complex for the ego.
He hates the word victim and people who have that victimized mentality, where they are the victim, woe is me. Do you see that more and more? Is that like a millennial thing, or is it?
Well, it's a form of justification for the use of power. You know, if you're a victim and you can ascribe moral superiority to yourself, then you're justified in the use of force. And I did a paper with a student of mine who had been toured the mass graves in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia with the UN, and we looked at the precursors to genocide, and one of them was an enhanced sense of victimization. That allows you to lash out at the hypothetical perpetrators before they do anything, because you're being victimized. You saw the same thing to some degree in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, Hitler felt very victimized.
Yeah, Hitler claimed that the Jews were victimizing Germany, essentially. And so once you're a victim and you have all the moral status that goes along with being a victim, then you can't do any wrong, essentially. So.
Okay, back to Ryan Eisler. Additionally, she doesn't see how the pathological feminine also supports the control system. She would desire to create lateral partnerships between all elite organizations under feminism to help create the interrelations of the control system. Pathological masculine and pathological feminine work hand in hand. Here, it blatantly says that the purpose of NVC is to create governmental and corporate structures. But as we can see, there is no learning with NVC. It's all about validation. Social theorists and cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School, which folded into postmodern academia, also focused on the dominator culture and the victim-perpetrator dynamic. Like Eisler, they saw firsthand the devastating effects of evil in tyrannical regimes, having to flee from Nazi Germany to come to America, where the Frankfurt School became the Institute for Social Research. Critical theory would perceive the master-slave imprint as a cultural structure, failing to see it as the premise of government and the control system as a whole. Their proponents would only see the trees but no forest. In this way, critical theory and cultural Marxism would be an intellectual trap for those seeking to understand the nature of collective evil and tyranny. After such horrifying events of the 20th century, you would think a moral relativist could be easily proven wrong. But sadly, these ideas that attempted to resolve collective evil would be still based in relativism, as they would associate truth and knowledge as a belief, dogma, narrative, and claim that it actually brings dominance. But in reality, truth and dogma are opposed. Rather than getting to the root of the cause, these postmodern ideologies would focus on creating cultural wars and social division, seeing all social and ethnic differences as a means for the power differential. Here's the rise of minority rights and multiculturalism. This would divert people's attention from real opposition, getting people to quarrel amongst themselves and become polarized with divide and conquer. In the West, we live today in a climate of misandry under the banner of feminism, and this would extend to the hatred of all things masculine, including logic and discernment.
Right, well, nobody has to save you because you're a fucking white man who gets to do whatever he wants to in this space, right? Aren't you quite aware by holding that video camera on me that you are surrounded by your privilege, right? Take your privilege somewhere else, please.
You're fucking a white male! So? You're a white man!
Ultimately, these ideologies feed into the communist socialist agenda by seeking to enlarge government to handle social injustices, many of which would be frivolous, in order to end human oppression, which is an oxymoron given that government is by nature a structure of oppression. Now we are going to discuss the human potential movement, which began from Rogers' humanistic psychology, Erikson's hypnosis, the MK Ultra mind control experiments, and also Abraham Maslow's theories of self-actualization, development, and peak experience. Maslow presented the hierarchy of needs, and this idea that all human motivation is based on needs would be a tenet of NVC. I'm also going to discuss Werner Erhard's EST training, which became Landmark Forum, which is based on the transformational models that seek to actualize one's potential. I have personal experience with that aspect of the human potential movement and find it to be way more interesting than NVC, although still troublesome. While NVC is about connecting with others, Landmark is about maximizing potential and opportunity in each moment. They both make up the feminine and masculine aspects of this movement, which is why it is good to examine both to see the whole of the movement. So later on, I will have a brief analysis on Landmark. Maslow's hierarchy of needs left out the need for knowledge and truth, prioritizing survival and security needs. It's no wonder that this is exactly what the government promises to humanity, to take care of us by providing us with our lower needs, which don't require anything higher like goodness, truth, and love. We could rationalize abuse of parents on children as long as they take care of them physically. Also, by putting needs in a hierarchy so that one need is required before the other is erroneous and rationalizes the lower needs over the higher ones. Also from the humanistic movement was the concept of the ideal self that would merely support the persona and ego, the desire for a social image of achievement, financial status, and value according to the dominator hierarchy. Notice that there is no objective reality in this model. The human potential movement is also connected to the civil rights movement and the New Age movement. While the civil rights movement desired equality for all, it became co-opted with socialist agendas as well. Like postmodernism, it fell into false egalitarianism, a pathological feminine. Hierarchical values, judgment and discernment, and natural inequalities in development, consciousness, and ability were perceived as oppressive and negative. Yes, excellence became oppressive, and so did knowledge. Today, the civil rights activists are the social justice warriors of the postmodern religion, not only a mockery of the civil rights era, which at least had some good in it, but as the end result of the uncorrected errors of this 1960s counterculture revolution. Any movement based on relativism has no good direction and can only get worse. Marshall Rosenberg was a civil rights activist during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And while the movement was correct in advocating the equality of rights between races and genders, it would lead to poisoned political activism. When the solution to human rights requires understanding what a right is objective morality and that the initiation of violence is wrong, instead, this movement was controlled opposition that sought to end violence by destroying the existence of moral polarity. Ironically, a moral relativist can never understand what true violence is. Like the civil rights movement, the New Age movement would seek social change, but through an ideological route, attempting to revive occult and esoteric knowledge. In a way, the New Age attempted to fulfill the place of natural law, but through a distortion and misteaching of spirituality. This is why some people in the Trivium camp mistakenly see natural law in a New Age sense.
The New Age movement is not in the business of feeding you beliefs. It's in the business of teaching you how you can question your beliefs, and then subsequently choose beliefs which serve you personally. If you ask me...
Well, like, what is Satanism, like, really?
I mean, to me, it's a logical format of exactly how to fundamentally get the most out of life.
And they tear you apart.
This relativism means that no one can judge if another's actions are good or evil. Morality is simply relative. This belief has led many New Agers to conclude that there is no real difference between good and evil. Writes Deepak Chopra, what is the nature of good and evil? God is the union of all opposites. Evil no longer exists. Shirley MacLaine claims that belief in good and evil leads to war. Until mankind realizes there is in truth no good and there is in truth no evil, there will be no peace.
As a proxy, the New Age would propagate dangerous half-truths and positive beliefs to feed cult communities and self-help business. Yet nothing opposes truth more than business and egoic resonance. The goal of the New Age was to make humanity one big happy family of hyper-positivity as to eliminate any alienating judgment from the group practices. Everyone is amazing. With these movements, we have the birth of Esalen and the California Institute of Integral Studies that would promote educational workshops with the psychological New Age, Eastern mysticism, and systems theory during the hippie movement. Esalen has links to elite organizations. Here the Tavistock Clinic is mentioned, which overlaps the early history of the Tavistock Institute with the goal of developing psychological warfare. When the clinic became the National Health Services, the Institute was formed to carry out the research that the NHS would not be able to. The Tavistock Institute's main funder was the Rockefeller Foundation. The goal was to destroy humanity for a global takeover through the systems of control.
And this present window of opportunity during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built will not be here open for too long. Already there are powerful forces at work that threaten to destroy all of our hopes and efforts to erect an enduring structure of global cooperation.
This woman, with 25 years of business leadership, which correlates to the masculine side of the human potential movement, has certifications from the Tavistock Institute, NVC, and NLP. Now this woman, holding an Aware Parenting Conference a few months ago, has graduated from the Tavistock Institute and has completed the foundation course on NVC. Many involved in MK Ultra are listed at Esalen, like Ewan Cameron, who we talked about. Another is Loretta Bender, who experimented with LSD and electroshock therapy on children. A main part of the human potential movement was NLP, that attempted to integrate the many aspects of postmodernism and psychology, especially the Milton's model of hypnosis and modern linguistics. The goal was to create behavioral changes through language. This introduced implanting suggestions in a person's mind, using unconscious signals and getting them to come to certain conclusions on their own. It was also about maximizing your rewards from the control system through hyper-adaptability. This is no real evolution. The irony is that NLP was being used while it was being taught, so that you would get sold on their product while learning how to sell.
Now Tony Robbins can be your personal coach with his 30-day personal power system. Learn how to master your emotions. I'm happier today than I've ever been.
NLP would be used by Anthony Robbins and his famous infomercials, and in the advertisement industry at large, with the rise of the personal coach industry, to act as a substitute for self-mastery that would often lead to parasitic relationships. Using language to control and manipulate people is certainly a form of mind control, which the salesman would rather have you forget. In the era of NLP, language would become a pragmatic tool for getting what you want without any moral considerations.
How well can you persuade and influence others? Stay tuned. This is Damon Cart from NLP Gem. How to manipulate people. NLP Mind Control Part 1. If you haven't already, please click subscribe to this YouTube channel so you can get these videos on a regular basis as well. First of all, we're always manipulating other people, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We've been doing it since we were kids. We depend on people. Therefore, we need to persuade and influence people to get what we want. NLP is a lot like a chess game. In a game of chess, you're constantly strategizing. You're constantly thinking 10 steps ahead, trying to get your opponent to step into your trap so that you can win. And you can play a game of chess without bringing any harm to your opponent. There's sort of this unconscious agreement that you and your opponent are going to sit down and play this game, and it's going to be for fun. Somebody's going to lose. Somebody's going to win.
As a quick side note, pragmatists and game theorists don't find anything wrong with playing the game to win and think that if everyone is aware that we are playing a game, that no harm can be done. But from a spiritual worldview, playing from the ego does create harm because you are basing the purpose and meaning of life on selfishness and materialistic agendas from the false self, rather than real evolution and the objective good. Cultish communities would become not only the business model of the New Age, but a social experiment for government mind control. And not just mind control, but emotional control, that it would elicit certain positive emotional states as a form of manipulation.
The attractive newscaster on the nightly news, she can whisper sweet nothings in your ear all night with the blue frequencies behind her, you know, okay, and say 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 = 5. And she's going to get a lot of people to believe that nonsense, right? But the person who's actually telling you the truth, that you might not like the sound of his voice, you might not like the harshness that he comes to you with the truth with, he might be screaming through a bullhorn and saying, hey, you're in danger. You are actively in danger.
Do you remember writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4? Yes. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
4.
And if the party says there are not 4, but 5, then how many?
5. 2 + 2 makes 4.
Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they're 5. Sometimes they're 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. Neither the past, nor the present, nor the future.
ساکت. نظم کلاسی حفظ کنیم. این درس اول امروزه. 2 + 2 = 5. با تکرار کنیم. 2 + 2 میشه 5. 2 + 2 چند میشه؟ 5 میشه. بلندتر. 2 + 2 چند میشه؟ 5 میشه. بلندتر. چند میشه؟ 5 میشه. تکرار کنیم.
مگه 2 + 2 4 نمیشه؟
من دارم بهتون میگم 2 + 2 5 میشه. پس چه سوال نیست. فهمیدی؟
فقط فکر کردیم که
فکر نکن. نمیخواد.
2 + 2 میشه 4. وقتی همیشه 4 میشه، چطوری ممکنه این 5 بشه؟
اصلا کی میتونه دست داد؟ به چند قیمت سوال میبری؟
آقا فهم خواستم بگم
2 + 2 5 میشه. تکرار کن.
ولی آقا روی تخت
تکرار کن. این آخرین فرصته.
Okay, so that was a bit of a tangent regarding physical control rather than emotional control. But that is what gun control is all about. Physical domination via government. You have to use emotional mind control to get people to give up their right to self-defense, and then you can use physical violence to get people to do whatever you want. And they do want to teach us that 2 + 2 is 5. Once you say that negatives don't exist, like NVC does, you might as well be saying 2 + 2 = 5. Telling people what they want to hear and getting them to feel good keeps people in a hypnotic regressed state to foster codependence and collective narcissism. Cults are many control systems that restrain individual thought, exploration, and expression, suppressing critical thinking as subordinate to group needs, in which individuals are more likely to conform and obey. It is the prioritization of the hive mind over the identity so that the collective identity takes precedence. Individuals susceptible to this have unresolved trauma, broken families, and were victims of bad parenting in which they attempt to treat a deep psychological wound with the wrong method and ideology, as New Age psychology only supports egoic desires and not real healing of the true self. Cults act as a healing proxy, to bind one to their trauma, to use as social leverage, and to exploit vulnerability. This is in addition to being a metaphysical proxy and a familial proxy. They seek to imitate the father through false ideology and mother through community, which provides social cohesion and uniformity. When Marshall Rosenberg uses puppets to display the overly simplistic worldview of NVC, this appears to be a form of manipulation to relax people's defenses and invoke their inner child and placate to familial needs. The tenets of the cult's ideology is a form of mind control and dogma, which represent the father archetype. The collective identity, community concepts, and emotional control attempts to represent the mother archetype. Since we have talked more about the former, let's go into the latter. The community attempts to mimic the undifferentiated state of mother and child, so that there is no division. With collectivist thought of the pathological feminine, one feels fused to another, seeing the other as an extension of themselves, in which there is no true ownership. This is how chameleon-like nature, and following cult leaders, has arisen from New Age collectivism. Combined with pragmatism, this becomes super-adaptability, being whatever works best in that particular moment, with the optimization of self-interest. In such a case, one has no true center. Today we see the social justice warriors doing this with gender fluidity and flexible identities. We can see why it is imperative for cults to resolve any conflict that might disrupt such a safe space, as cult leaders would pervert our need for safety. The millennial social justice warriors also yearn for the ultimate safe place of the mother's womb and their inability to handle criticism. This is why they want to enforce laws to destroy free speech so that no one's feelings can be hurt with words, so that everyone is safe. In the pathological feminine, the lack of discernment is conflated with bliss and ignorance with peace. While the surrogate mother of the community attempts to mimic unconditional love, it is very conditional to your acceptance of the cult's ideology, as challenges to the doctrine is prohibited, leading to censorship and taboo topics. This toxic environment makes it difficult for people to interact with others outside of NVC, revealing its cult-like nature. We see this consensus-type thinking at the New World Order think tanks, in which everyone seems to be on board with the plans of the global elite, as the lack of dissenting voices seems artificial, which it is. Because this is a system that uses punishment and rewards, those who adhere to the consensus paradigm have successful careers, and those who don't, since the money game is a big part of the control system. The empiricist destruction of the notion of archetypes and the postmodernist destruction of the notion of gender prevents people from gaining self-knowledge and healing their parental issues. Healing from these issues involves differentiating from the corrupted mother-father archetype that was imprinted on us by identifying it, understanding why our parents are the way they are, and then forgiving them. And it is important to understand here that you can forgive them even if they do not apologize or ask for forgiveness. The next is gaining the knowledge of the correct archetype so that it is grounded in the absolute, natural law, and then recognizing your connection to the archetype through correspondence of self. This is the understanding part of knowledge. Finally comes action that is in alignment with the archetypes in their appropriate expression. While any type of control system and cult will externalize archetypes to plug you into their matrix, freedom and evolution require that we internalize the archetypes and develop the aspects of consciousness within ourselves in the alchemical journey. It is this inward journey that all propaganda is attempting to prevent.
By acting as a surrogate family, cults seek to keep adults in a childish state.
We are the children, builders of the future, and we the children swear to thee loyal devotion, fearless devotion, and to die with dignity.
As the more childish people are and behave, the more they desire or so-called need and create government, as external anarchy and the state of freedom can only exist for cosmic adults with moral accountability.
Many cults merely correspond to the larger cult of the control system and global government, which also requires social cohesion and group identification. Thus, the feminine is just as responsible for evil as the masculine.
This is our land, a land of peace and of plenty. A land of harmony and hope. This is our land, Oceania.
The dark occultists do not want us to understand what self-defense is and the rights of the individual, immersing us in egalitarian collectivism so that we do not protect ourselves by exercising the sacred masculine. The cult of government also acts like the surrogate parent with daddy capitalism and the ideology of pragmatic moral relativism, along with mommy socialism, under humanism, the cult of humanity to be directed and controlled by human authority. We could boil down the world's problems to the existence of cults, the cult of the control system as a whole, the cult of religion, including the cult of the dark priest class, the cult of money, the cult of politics, and the cult of New Age communities like NVC. The solution to human slavery? Quit your cult today.
And they tear you apart.
Stay tuned for part 3, the final video in this series.